Har du ljud nu? Men stäm av det med klockorna så ska jag se vad det är.
It's time to start. And welcome here, everyone. And this lecture today will be the first of 11 lectures describing and discussing what's going on in the different studios in this school in year 4 and 5. So one of the aims is actually to enhance the discussions and knowledge about what's going on and what is discussed and actually being produced in each studio. A little bit about the teachers and the courses, the projects, and what the students are doing. So, like every second Tuesday from today, there will be a lecture, and the first lecture today will be on Advanced Design Studio with Professor Johan Celsing. So, please.
Yes, this has been discussed to get sort of different students of different studios to see what the others are doing, and I think it's probably quite helpful. The studios are not so large, so it's probably a welcome way to integrate ideas and so on. So I'm Johan Celsing. I'm teaching in this studio with Roger Spets, whom some of you know, and also this year with Swiss architect Tobias Nissen. And we have this studio of advanced design since a few years. And I will present a little bit of how we work, but of course, primarily I will present thoughts, reflections, and opinions of myself that, of course, is very much related to what is done in the studio, though there is a difference, of course. And I will also present 3 current works. I will present them along, or rather after, a first introduction of the thoughts and the reflections. You could certainly say that these ideas or these works are sort of dependent on, they're influenced, they're affected by the ideas that we're working with in the studio and that I have. But also you can certainly say that the ideas that I put forward here are certainly not, you can say they're taken directly into the works. I mean, the works are not programmatic in the sense that they are sort of fulfilling certain intellectual ideas. You could say that these things are certainly related, but they are also, to some extent, independent. But let me first introduce these works and what I think is interesting and what we have been dealing with in the studio since a little while. And the title says at least something, and of course it is Rules and Rites. And rules and rites in the form-making of architecture is, I would say, has been for, should we say, thousands of years, extremely important. Though maybe the last century or so, not quite as it used to be. And particularly myself, being born in the 1950s, I was very much brought up in a situation where rules was something that you were supposed to overthrow, which was something which sort of, in the ancient times there were rules, but this is now we know better, or in case there are rules, let's kick them out, or let's sort of rethink them and so on. And as well as you could even say rites is an even more debatable maybe concept in our time, but I still think it's very relevant. And I certainly don't have ideas that how rules should be adhered to or how rites should be performed, but just sort of introducing these issues in our work, I think it can be very helpful. So what I'm trying to do, and I think what we do in the studio for quite a bit, is bringing in a few concepts that we think can be kind of assisting us in our development of architecture. And of course rules and even rites, I think, are not the most common ones, but I think they're interesting. As well as I think it was said on the text produced by Staffan that I will touch upon issues such as originality, which is how that has shifted from ancient times to today. Also something of the eclectic. But let me first start with rules, and I could even make a quote from someone whom I think is very interesting. It's this poet, the poet W.H. Auden, who was a British poet born, I think, in 1907, died in, I think, 1973. He was a very interesting poet. It was a kind of wunderkind, if you like. He became early on very well known, and he was you could say he was a radical, he was an intellectual, he was homosexual, which was really a trouble in Great Britain when he was brought up. So he was an avant-garde person for sure, though he very early on, not immediately, but quite early on, he realized the possibilities of the metrical rules, what we in Swedish would say, I think, versmåtten or something like this. The metrical rules that has been since ancient times how you arrange a poem and how you remember a poem. Even more probably importantly, before there was writing, there was of course poems. There are ways, even if we take a walk, we have easier to both sing and talk, I think, because we have a certain meter coming from the rhythm of our walk. So, but Auden was very interesting. He elaborated his from the mid 30s. He elaborated always his poems in different meters, if it was hexameter or if it was other classical meters. But he also was knowledgeable about other meters, such as the Nordic, the Icelandic meters. So he was really advanced in all that. And what he wrote here, I think, is interesting. He says that blessed be all the metrical rules that forbid automatic responses, force us to have second thoughts, and free us from the fetters of the self. So that to me is, I mean, he was, as I said, he was really a politically very engaged person. He was really a kind of, he was certainly a modernist poet, but he was really also very, not dependent, but he used the metrical rules to clarify what he wanted to say. And I think this is, you could say, in Swedish, there's something called bunden form, you know, and the form is bounded. I don't know in English how you say it, but so there are possibilities about this. And I would like to mention another poet who died just a few years ago, the Danish poet Inger Christensen. She was a very interesting poet who did a fantastic, her latest, which you should read, it's very accessible, her latest poem that was published before she died was called The Butterfly Valley, in Danish Sommerfugledalen, so the Fjärilsdalen in Swedish. And that is a sonnet circle. There are 15 sonnets, and each sonnet, which has 14 lines, or 15 lines, that's begins with one line, and the ending of the previous sonnet's line is the first on the next. And then the circle of sonnets ends with a final sort of master sonnet, which in fact uses all those lines into making one sonnet. So it sort of brings together all of this. And you could say it's a sort of an incredible, almost mathematical feat to get this all together. But that's not the point. And you could find her written about in books, and someone saying that, oh, how extraordinary this is, be able to write something good with such strong rules. I would say the opposite. I would say that the possibility, the fantastic poem that she wrote was in a way dependent on the rules. That was what could, because the poem, the Butterfly Valley, is, she calls it a requiem. So it deals obviously with sort of reflections on her own death, on life, on her childhood, but it really sort of spans her whole life. She was not so young when she wrote it, and it deals also with butterflies. This very sort of the sort of insects living a very, very short life. And I would say that the very strong form, the very strong meter that she has. Of course, the sonnets were used by Shakespeare, and lately there are some young Swedish poets also making use of it. His name slips me at the moment. But I mean, I would say that the form of these metrical rules, what sort of keeps together this very delicate, this very difficult topic of discussing or sort of reflecting on your own death and so on. So that's how I look upon the rules, or the possibilities of the rules, rather than something that is sort of something that assists us in being able to say something or draw something or build something that needs, so that we can sort of make use of that everything is not open to discussion, but there are certain things that need to be well, there's a certain rule about certain things, though the rules can change, of course. And there are then, I mean, in music, for instance, there are different ways to perform. There are different tone categories in different parts of Europe and so on. So the rules needn't be all too strict. And I think the rules even is an interesting concept. I mean, if we, it also deals with what is appropriate. I was speaking this morning to students about Alberti, whom I think is Leon Battista Alberti, of course, the Italian Renaissance architect, whom I think is a very interesting architect. And he, of course, was developing his idea about decorum. Decorum in English, I guess, would be something like what is appropriate. And the idea decorum may seem like something that a building should look or shouldn't be too different from its neighbor, the kind of the rule of the convention. But I think that's a complete misunderstanding. The idea about what is appropriate, the decorum, is something much more profound, because it deals what is appropriate. And Alberti meant that you don't do the same kind of house for the ruler as for the not ruling or for the church. Every subject has their different, there are sort of, if not rules, there are different things appropriate for different matters. And that, of course, goes back to Cicero, to the Roman writer, and particularly to how Aristotle discussed the virtues. And the virtues, or as we say in Swedish, dygderna. And Aristotle is very interesting reading in the Nicomachean Ethics, where he discusses what is the skäliga, as it's called in Swedish when you translate it. So Aristotle is very, he knows and he can say very distinctly that the rules is always something, the law, for instance, the law is always something that can never be as precise as the particular case which it should sort of solve. But there still needs to be a law, there still needs to be a rule. But so Aristotle says something like the good judge or the good law can never be precise. So the good law should be like the canon of lead in Lesbos, where they do, and the canon of lead, of course, was a kind of ruler, a canon regel in Swedish, actually. A canon of lead, of bly, which is sort of soft, so you could turn it according to one stone, so you can cut another stone to fit that. So that's the kind of how he talks about the rules, that the rules is not necessarily, the rule is always less precise than the actual case. But you cannot, in a law, you cannot as a rule have every case sort of looked into. You cannot be precise about that. So he's saying what is appropriate is sort of the negotiated correctness. And I think that's a very interesting matter in our life as well, or in our work, because we cannot find, we could do buildings that are extremely advanced or high or spectacular and so on, but it's what is maybe even the most difficult or the most important is doing buildings that are appropriate to their use. I mean, we can do something extremely spectacular because it needs for its purpose to be spectacular, but most buildings probably needn't. So then something else is what is demanded. And I think that's sort of this issue of how we can go from rules into what is appropriate. And that is, as Alberti said, the biggest glory among an architect is to find what is appropriate. And going from there, let's say a few words about rites. Of course, rites is a concept which is, as rules, complicated and too much maybe to get into on this presentation. But still, I mean, if we think of rites, we have a typical tradition of when we're burying each other, when we're burying our people, our parents, or whoever it is. There was the rule that there's and of course, if we go to a traditional burial or funeral, there will be a clergyman giving a speech about the deceased, but in fact he speaks mostly about other matters, about matters of life and death. And we can all sit in the church or whatever kind of place it is. We could sit there sort of contemplating our own death, our own life, or our families, whatever it is. And then there is a little part of the rite which deals with a specific, the one who died just in this time. And that could be then, of course, I've been, and you may too, have been to funerals that are sort of not religious, they're not traditional, they are sort of modern in the sense that they don't follow the typical Christian or whatever ritual it is. And then you come to a situation where the family should say, and the whole rite or the whole ceremony is dealing with a specific person who has just died, which is sort of a very, I have been experiencing that myself, about sitting in a funeral and in fact realizing that it's quite difficult because every demand is on those who should bury their people, and instead of that, the rite is something that brings us all together. It brings us into reflecting on certain things and sharing certain aspects of life, and then we split. And you could say about buildings, when you started doing buildings in the old towns, of course there were many rites, some which were, as Auden I think said at some point, abominable. They were pretty hopeless. But one can also say that only in rites may our oddities be, maybe sort of lift off our oddities and be completely entire. That was what Auden actually said. And this is quite an interesting, so rites I still believe is a very useful aspect of our life, just as rules. Though of course we need to treat them sort of with respect to ourselves and to our fellow men. Two more things about originality, as I said. I think that there's an issue of originality which today, of course, we have the media spectacle, and we have the right maybe also of novelty, the sort of the whole aspect of bringing in new things all the time. And I think it's something comforting to read how the lack of interest in originality in the old times, because it was really the kind of originality that we think of today didn't really exist. But rather what architects was supposed to do a few hundred years ago was to really know their craft very well and to know maybe how buildings were, they saw in study trips, how that was built, how the cornice of that building was, how the space of that theater looked, or how the church, whatever, how they, and then sort of bringing all that together in the most appropriate form. It was not a question of doing, it was not bad that the building didn't look all new. And I think it's more or less the same today. Of course, we cannot do, every one of us cannot do original works. It's sort of a pretty hopeless situation. Also, it's a pretty unreasonable demand on each one of us. And I think this is putting a lot of strain on ourselves, on the community in some sense. If we sort of get to know, to get our craft, to get to know how we can build things in another way, I think that would be very helpful. And there comes, in a way, the eclectic. I think that architects, maybe a few hundred years ago, and I spoke of Tessin, Nicodemus Tessin this morning, I think you could certainly say that he was a very eclectic architect, but not at all in a negative sense. I think the eclectic, to me, in my upbringing, I think the eclectic has certainly had negative connotations. Whereas I would think it's interesting to look into it that, and in a way, many of us do this. We do sort of sample a lot, but still the kind of novelty or the demand for novelty or original works is still very high. So I think this thing about being very upfront about that we cannot, this is not all new. It's mostly, it's very close to something else, but it's adjusted to this specific situation, to my client or to my thoughts. And if we get to sort of tune the works into what is specifically demanded from us, this is difficult, this is sort of difficult enough in our work. So I would say that this issue of originality is really something that needs to be, you say, confronted or changed. So going from there, I will show you a few images of things that certainly are dealing with rules, but in a way setting up their own rules. And of course, one architect whom I think is so interesting is Adolf Loos, the Austrian architect. And this is one of his later works, the Villa Müller in Prague from 1929 or so. And of course, Loos had developed a kind of plan, what was called and is called the Raumplan, space plan in English maybe. And that's an idea about buildings that usually have a quite austere exterior, where not so much of what happens on inside is visible. Whereas if you look at that section, the relatively complicated section, and all these different rooms and all these different staircases that are sort of interconnected, but also it's like this, what do I say, Rurik's cube, where it's sort of a very complex game in 3 dimensions. And I think that's certainly is something where Loos had a kind of rule, a kind of idea how this should be developed. And it had also reasons on the exterior, the buildings were relatively mute. And that in a way very much was as he looked upon it, that buildings on the outside should be more civilized, being able to sort of stand next to each other, almost like we have to do sitting here or somewhere else. Whereas our interiors are usually much more complicated, much more, but you couldn't show all of that at the same time. So the more complicated interior is sort of hidden behind the facade. But there is certainly, of course, a rule. Something which may not deal with rule, but deal with an attitude that is slightly sort of not following the strict rule of the time, is Heinrich Tessenow, the German architect, who was probably the same generation as Loos, more or less. And at the time when the modernism and the Bauhaus architecture, or the modernistic works before the Bauhaus time were developed, he was very sort of insisting on a quiet normality of life in Germany. And then unfortunately for Tessenov, he had Albert Speer as his student, and he became sort of loved by the Nazis, which sort of made him gave him guilt by suspicion in some sense. But he is a very interesting architect who somehow refrained from the immediate sort of novelty of modernists, which I think is very interesting to look into. This is another view of his from an interior from maybe 1920 or so. Another work, though, by the same architect, a little later in Berlin, Stadtbad Mitte, which still is there, is a very obviously very open, very transparent building. But then it's for the necessity of glaze, getting light in and so on. It's not for sort of being seen as something radical. The exterior rather sort of merges with quite a bit of the townscape around. So I think this is, these two architects, I think they're as different as they are, I think they're very interested. And if there's something that I think could go with any student, it's sort of developing knowledge of certain ideas, if it's the treatises of architecture, as I told some of as Alberti this morning, or if it's sort of developing a great knowledge of certain architects, if it's laws or if it's Tessenov, or in my case, I think also there's been numerous Swedish architects that has been very important in my study of architecture, such as some of these has been for instance, the brothers Alsen, Erik and Tore Alsen, both architects born at the beginning of the 20th century. That leads us over to some things that we have been dealing with in the studio for quite some years, and I think it's been quite important. And that's the sort of the practical side, getting to know the work of the profession, or getting to know architecture also not only as an intellectual idea, but also getting to know how you do the things, if it's with your hands or finding the proportions in what is built or what is drawn. And there we have done case study models lately, and some of you may have a case study model to do now in the coming week. But this is from a few years ago. We had them presented. So this is one year when they did concert halls. You will see the Stockholm concert hall here, and quite a few others that you may recognize. And these were and we did them to have, as this year as well, that there's both a cut through the major space of the building, but also you can sense some of the exterior compared to what is on the inside. I think this is really a good way of getting to know these architects that we're dealing with. This is the brothers Alsen, the major, the Medborgarhuset in Örebro, and the theater there. Many of you may recognize Rem Koolhaas' Casa del Musica in Porto. Something earlier, which is the Bibliothèque Saint-Geneviève in Paris by La Proust. Finally, the Stockholm, the Tengbom Concert Hall. Another thing we've been doing in the studio is measuring buildings, or measuring parts of buildings. I think that sometimes in architecture schools one starts in elementary studies to get a sense of how one builds, one starts measuring. We have been doing measuring of another kind, which deals rather with the kind of atmosphere that the architecture has. And in this case, we did 3 years of private houses, and they were very unusual because they were very distinct and interesting private houses, but they were still, the people who had lived there had just died, but there was their original interiors. And this is the Ralph Erskine house in Drottningholm. This is built about 1964 or so. And what we've been doing is measuring these buildings not as complete buildings, not as the structure and on the complete exterior. We've been focusing on only measuring the interiors to sort of get a sense, or try to put down on paper what are the qualities, what are the materials, what are the measures between the windows or pieces, and what are the pieces of furniture, to get sort of an understanding or a heightened experience of how the architect could bring together this kind of quality of space or character in the space and so on. So So we've been very much dealing with furniture, which of course in private houses is very important. When it comes to other buildings, it's other things. But so here, that's the exterior, if you wouldn't know the house, from early 60s. That's the interior with, I think, some students sitting. And here maybe a drawing or two. That's a section where most pieces of Ralph Erskine's furniture was still here. He had died maybe 3 years before or a few years before. And here we even had the bookcase. And I said to the student, what does he have there? So luckily, one of the students actually had photographed, not only sort of drew how the bookcase looked and so on and what was the books, but actually took photographs and brought into the drawings each of the titles and the authors of all the books, which we felt was kind of funny. He probably had more books than that. But so there's a great variety of the things. Here, of course, there are some musical instruments and there's the furniture, some of his own designs and some of others' designs. Here you see this very rich and varied combination of well-known Arne Jacobsson pieces together with more unusual and the fireplace. Oops, the fireplace. So, and then this thing about bringing in both furniture, also the kind of the patterns that are on the wall. Sometimes we've been having all the frames of painting and so on drawn in to get a sense of how did he achieve, the architect achieve the quality. Here is also some documentation of the embellishments in the house. So these are things that we've been doing, and this is another, unfortunately these are not yet edited, but this is from the Sigurd Leverens Malmö Cemetery, which has 2 chapels from about 1942, 45 maybe. And this is the canopy in front of one of them. It's a bit weak in the drawing here, but you see them here. So this was what we did last year, and we will continue this year. This is unfortunately very little of this. And of course there's not the same amount of furniture, but there are other qualities of how details of the openings and the brickwork and all of that. So these are things that we've very thoroughly looked into. And I think to me, it's an incredible experience to put down on paper these things. And to sort of, because there's you could do a drawing which is the worst drawing ever, though what you put down in your notebook, you will remember in 1,000 times better than the sort of the snapshot you took. And I think that's the kind of just doing it on yourself, just like if you write a telephone number, you certainly remember it better than having it on a screen. And I think that's quite important in our practice, in the practice of architecture. That doesn't change that good architecture is not done only with sort of great drawings, but to heighten your sense of how you can achieve spaces that are sort of appropriate for what's going to take place there. If it's this lecture room or if it's something else, I think that's the core. It's not the only, but that's really the core of our profession in my view. So having said that, I'll show you 3 works that are very much interrelated because they were built more or less at the same time. This small private house was built the first, but they're all in brick. They're all, I think, relatively unobtrusive as exteriors. I think many people would pass them by, think, well, that's another box or something, or there's another sort of brick structure. Though, and I think that's fine because every building cannot be very interesting. Though, what is more important in my view is that the buildings, if you have to go to this church or if you have to visit this house, there could be many levels of way to perceive it. You could just find the door easily, or you could, when you had to wait for the door, you may see, well, what a strange pattern on these bricks. And then you may see that this stone, this paving, there must be something behind it. It's sort of that it grows on you. That's probably quite an important aspect in my way of working. So this little private house is It's very exclusive. I probably never did, and maybe never will be doing this as a house as exclusive as this. But it's still relatively small. It's some 13 by 13 meters. And on the lowest floor, it does have a pool space, but it sits in a kind of slope on a hill. So this pool room at the ground floor is opened with sliding doors, glazed sliding doors to one direction, and then has a skylight at this point, bringing down light from above. You see it here. Here's the skylight, and here brings down light here. And then the entry floor is here with a dining room and a fireplace. And in the center is the staircase. And on the top floor is the staircase leading up, and it sort of is a L-shaped building with a large terrace paved in a kind of stone, which is very, very much like the brick. And what this has, which apart from the brick connects it to the following works, is the brick, which is arranged. It's a concrete structure. So the brick is only a cladding on top of this concrete structure. But the brick joints is arranged so there are only sort of almost a kind of vertical seams. And these bricks are in fact quite unusual bricks. They are 52 centimeters long. And they are arranged so the pattern is very almost textile-like. So it will be quite evident also, at least for the architect, that this is probably not a load-bearing brick building. You can distinguish that this is only a cover of brick. That's is of no interest to the layman, of course. But for someone who is interested, I think such a thing could be understood. And so this is how the building looks from the south. As I said, there is a large terrace for these upper living rooms, and then the dining room and so on is here. And maybe some of you will see that there are some kind of almost seams where all the joints are they're separated by 10.8 centimeters, each of the vertical joints. So that creates, and they are then connected to the opening, the sides of the opening. So they are going seams going down there, 50 centimeters to the next. So I wouldn't say this looks textile. It probably looks pretty bulky. But if you go further into looking into how it's built, then you could sense a kind of brick quality of one kind that is here, but is on another very different kind on the next work, which is a church. But what this building also has is something which makes it interrelated to the final work I'll show. It is this, as I said, there's a pool space on the lower part, which is here in the rock, more or less. And that's a pool space. The client said they are obviously swimming all day or every day where they live now, and they're moving to Sweden, and they wanted to have the same possibility. And we made this pool 12.5 meters in the cellar. And there was this thing, how should it be done? And I think pool spaces are very often quite dull because they're all kinds of tiles of different kinds. And I felt, could it be a more homogeneous material? So I tested, could it be done in concrete, all white concrete, which was something we did quite a bit of research about. It's rarely done, but we did it, and finally the client also accepted it. But before showing an image of that, here you see a little better how these, what I call seams, is sort of characterizing the very flat facade. There's very little of things happening apart from that pattern. The brick is a Danish brick, the so-called Columba brick. Some of you may know it. Peter Zumthor used it for this old church in Köln. And here again, the seams, you can see how they sort of follow each other. There's no wild arrangement. I mean, there are many brick patterns, but this is this is something which you could say you could not really do if you had a load-bearing wall, because then, of course, the outer shield of the brick facade needs to connect to the inside, which this never does. Here is under construction the white concrete. So the white concrete here is all it's not any pigment poured into it. It's rather white cement from the ground in Denmark, and then there's dolomite cross, so it's a kind of marble. So it's both the walls, the roof, the column, and also the pool going down. So it's all the same, and you could sense the kind of quality. And what's interesting about doing this is, of course, that we wanted to have it all white concrete. So then it's a very dramatic situation when you do all the formwork, because when you take away the form, all the arrangements of the formwork is you see afterwards. All the joints, we had no sort of triangular cuts on any piece. Everything was arranged square, and also you see all these patterns. So there had to be arrangements about all these plywood panels that made up the formwork, and then you take away the formwork, and then you see how good you have thought, or how good the contractors were at doing the concrete casting. And this is a circular space, and simply there's this central staircase leading down here. So I wanted to make use of the recess that is under the staircase. Here is very high because this staircase starts there. So here they could put the children's things, the balls or whatever they have in the pool, they could be put in there, or also here. But here, of course, I couldn't do it the same high opening there, so I felt, why not do something more or another shape. So that's the private house. The church is a very different story. It's the same municipality, it's Stockholm. This is a suburb from the 1940s. And what existed at the site was this building, which is a parish building from 1968 in brick. And there was a competition for this, and I suggested a building which was to be a separate building, it was a very tiny church. They shouldn't be very expensive, so I thought this should be probably concrete elements or something like this. Painted red, I thought, and white. After a while, the client, having won the competition, the client asked me to make the new building merge with the existing, and they had very good reasons for it. So I said, of course, yeah, we'll try that. So finally, the new church that is built is actually sort of connected to the existing building, which wasn't the idea about that separate red-colored building. And during the time of design, I worked a lot on how to bring in light to this space. I felt that a good daylight was very important, I felt. And so I had many ideas for very advanced, but at least sort of complicated skylights, bringing down light from above where you didn't sometimes see the light source, but there was sort of a lit space. But also working with that for quite a while, I felt it became sort of too important. It became like the building became a kind of vehicle for light, whereas to me, a church, and getting back to sort of to this thing about what is appropriate, I felt that the more I worked on it, and this took a few years from the competition to building it, so I felt that maybe the most important thing would be actually to do a space which is not quite so interesting in spatial terms, but maybe more to the point when it comes to the rituals that is being performed or done there. So I felt that maybe it could be quite an ordinary space with even ordinary windows. So that was how it was then developed. But this is all a load-bearing space, a load-bearing building with brick as both the structure and the cladding. And then this space was developed also with a kind of seating around the sides. So it's a pretty small space, which is square in its plan. It has a font, baptismal font at the center. And then these very large windows that are sort of 5 meters high. And this is how it connects to the existing building, which had a very interesting atrium. And these are numerous sketches of how to do then, if there would be ordinary windows, how should the ceiling be? Should there be a 9 square arrangement of different beams, or should it be just one beam at the center? It was a question of giving this, in a space which is all square, which has relatively symmetrical windows. I felt also there could be a reason to bring in something which is not quite as symmetrical as that. So finally the solution was bringing in a series of beams which are not all orthogonal, but rather are sort of sliding in their directions. And we do many models, not only in the studio, but also in the office. So this is a 1:25 model, and these are studies inside of that about these beams, how their directions should be, and so on. And then this is all brick, but it's white painted brick. And this is the plan, the altar and the font, and all the benches along the sides, and that's the reflected ceiling plan. And this is the section through the building, through the outer wall, which is a kind of massive, it's a massive brick structure, but it does have a cavity for insulation, which is needed in our climate. But the load-bearing piece, both these, the outer shield and the inner, they are connected with the kind of connectors. So in fact, it's just one stable building, though it does have some insulation inside. And then it's sort of a profile with this brick bench, the glazed brick bench. And if these openings are pretty elementary, I still wanted to make a building, not just a very heavy brick. I mean, as heavy as the building is. And the reason for making it brick, which I didn't tell you, having started with a more red-white building that was stood to the side of the existing, when the client urged me to sort of join the two so there would be just one building, I felt it wouldn't make sense to make the addition in another material, exterior material than the rest of the building, which was sort of dark red brick. So I felt it was quite more reasonable to do them all in brick. So that's how this sort of brick building came about. And then, as I said, the openings are very high, and the walls are in fact 88 centimeters thick, which is obviously quite unusual in these times. But it has this cavity with insulation here, and it does also have a kind of recess on the sides of the windows. And I think, to me, that was quite important to not make it all too sort of heavy. And this kind of how the light comes from outside being reflected in the kind of, and this is big enough for a person to stand in. So it's really a cavity in the wall. And this is how it's built. This is the exterior brick. Here sits the window. Here is this recess, and that's the inner part. So they're different. The brick on the inside that is painted white is it's a less expensive brick than on the exterior. But on the lower part where there's the bench is all glazed brick with holes that is for the acoustics. Here you could get some sense of the size of that window under construction. This is the little chapel, the smallest chapel, which only has light overlit, not too different from this the skylight to this pool space that I just showed previously. And here are the glazed, in the children's chapel there's green glazed bricks. And this is the entry. There are two entries, one from the existing parish building and another entry from the outside, from the west, which is, the old, what we in Sweden call vapenhuset. So here's the sacristy, here's the entry, here's the recess on the facade, and here's the church proper. And you could sense that certainly this was correctly drawn, but of course there may be rules of how to build it, but before the masons have gotten their act together, they're sort of slightly sliding on how to do this kind of tooth, so it sort of differs from the lower part to the upper. And this is how it is today. And you can sense the in situ cast ceiling. So it's a very square open space where all the benches could be even stacked on top of each other or moved in many directions, but two things are fixed, the baptismal font and the altar. This is the children's chapel, as I mentioned. And seen in the window is the other part, the older part, the parish building. And the ceiling is a kind of test on a little smaller, also in situ cast concrete, an ordinary grey, or not so grey, but an ordinary concrete with slightly smaller holes than in the big church. So the final work is something which is now under construction, and as I said, it is, or if I didn't, it's the Woodland Cemetery, which is a municipal burial ground. It's not we say in Swedish, we say Skogskyrkogården, but of course there's no church here, so it's really it's a kind of, you can be buried there if you're Christian or if you're whatever denomination really. And this is one of the well-known photographs from the 1930s when this, or from the 40s when this was just finished. Asplund and Leverance collaborated on the work, but unfortunately Asplund did this on his own, not by his own choice though. But before getting into the building, and I will say a few words about cemeteries, because of course this cemetery is very much built upon an idea of a certain kind of cemetery. And it's a cemetery which is different from, if for many centuries there were the city of the dead as a kind of concept on how to do burial grounds. So particularly in the Catholic countries and so on, there were many small mausoleums, and this is, of course, this is not even from Europe, this is from South America. But this thing of the city of the dead was a concept which was not at all what is done at the Woodland Cemetery. Rather, what is done there is something that is sort of dependent on a kind of European, how should I say, romantic tradition. And this is, of course, an image of Caspar David Friedrich from the 1820s. And it's not an open religious image, but I think it's this idea about a place where someone contemplates something, and this could well be a place where people have been buried. And you could say that idea was a kind of, or that, not that particular idea of that image, but rather the romantic idea of using the forest as a place for burials is something that came up around the late 19th century. And the Woodland Cemetery is part of that, but there are many other, of course, cemeteries from the same time. One in Switzerland, for instance, the name slips me, but this is, it's not entirely a Swedish concept. And this is how it looks though. And of course there's a lot of trees, but in fact it's a very tidy wood, and that's of course necessary to make it possible to have graves there. And this is the more open spaces that was particularly designed by Leverance when Asplund were doing the first chapel. Asplund or Leverance was doing the landscaping, the Hill of Remembrance. And then there is a cross, but in fact that cross was not meant to be there. It was a donator, and obviously the municipality couldn't say no. The plan here is from Asplund's office in the 1940s, just when the main crematorium and the 3 chapels were finished. The competition for this new crematorium was here, and we are now building the crematorium just here. The Asplund's first little forest chapel that you know is here, located here, and further up this long path is the Leverance Resurrection Chapel. This, of course, is the first building on the site, and next to it is a building that had some importance to me. I've frequently been asked, so your building, is it very dependent on the others? And I have, of course, known these buildings since I began studying architecture, but this building I didn't know so well. This is the morgue, or the likboden, I think it's called in the old drawings. So this, I think, had some impact on me. And of course, the building that we have designed, the crematorium, it's not a chapel primarily. It's rather a technical facility, or it's of another kind than the very public buildings at the site. This, of course, is Leverance Resurrection Chapel, the interior, which is so interesting. It's a very austere, kind of classical building, but it has a detailing which really grows on you. Just sitting in this chapel, where the coffin may be here, you are sitting almost like on the river of Styx, where you have the kind of, you could look upon the stone mosaics that are here almost as waves in the Styx, and this could be the Charon's boat. So there are really numerous interpretations that you can do to this, as well as you could look at it as a very austere, just an austere piece of volume. That's how you interpret it. But this, of course, is the exterior of the same building. You enter here, and you're walking out from this entry, out into down the steps. The main building, of course, finished in about 1940, with the crematorium being on the back side, with the two smaller chapels and the big chapel there. You probably know a lot about this. So this wood that we're working in is a very different wood. It was really meant to be a kind of backdrop to the Asplund main crematorium and chapels. So this is, as you see, it's a very wild wood. As you don't see, there are no graves here, and that was the reason why they had the competition to be there. I think they wanted some kind of safety distance. It's just 150 meters from the crematorium, but this is a kind of wild wood where the trunks are lying sort of crossways, since there's no maintenance whatsoever. But there is a slight clearing, a slight opening, because there was probably a house there maybe 150 years ago. So you can sense there's also a few trees growing there that must come from someone living there. But so this is the main chapel, the two other chapels. And on the back side, here the competition area was really a long stretch, not a long, but it was a stretch of land here. Finally, I decided on putting the building at the very end of it, so you could have, so you could have a path, a walkway up to the building where you could sort of prepare yourself for what was going to take place. This is the model from the competition. It's a pretty bulky, almost square building. And here is how it sits among these very large pines in a kind of sloping terrain, where the building also has almost sort of connects to the terrain. And the motto, it was a anonymous competition. So the motto for the scheme that I chose was "A stone in the forest." So that I think they wanted quite a bit of building which didn't make too much noise. They didn't want to have something which would overthrow the rest of the crematorium, but rather the rest of the site. So a stone in the forest became a kind of idea to make it merge with the forest rather than stand out as a very special thing. This was the initial idea about an entry for the mourners who come at this point, for the public entrance where you could come in to see the deceased in the coffin or follow the cremation. And I had an idea about an big opening where they could be standing, the relatives. Even before handing in the competition, I had doubts about this kind of canopy being too so I felt it should be concrete, which is still at least grey, but I felt it was too weak. But there was no time to change it, so this has been done after, luckily, having won the competition. But this was another not very advanced image from the competition. But what I worked on in the competition really for a few months was developing the plan, making it into a very compact plan. And I think that often in buildings, making a statement on the exterior is one thing. That can come sometimes more easily, whereas developing an incredibly tight plan where everything works is really a kind of challenge, and a kind of almost mathematical challenge of trying to make the kind of equation work out. So this is in many sketches, and you will see a few of them. You could see these are the 4 furnaces, the 4 ovens where the cremation takes place. These are the 3 cold stores where all the coffins can be stored. And here are where the cars are loading in the coffins into the cold stores. And here is where the mourners enter to visit a place where they could look into when the cremation is taking place, or come and fetch the urn once the cremation is finished, or they can also come and see the deceased. So there's a little public entry, or not a little. There's a public way to use this building, but it's primarily a facility that should take care of all these cars that come and load in coffins. And then there's the part where the people working are, and they are located around sort of a courtyard. My idea was that finally that these people that work here, they shouldn't be going out to have a coffee in the wood, standing next to the mourners that are having their people cremated, but rather it would be good to have their own place where they could be on their own and sort of not connecting. So these are early studies, and you could sense sort of early studies of a quite a linear structure, and many of the other schemes had actually linear, quite long buildings. I felt that having tested this, I realized that the building would be problematic in the wood. Also, technically, you would have the mourners at one point and the trucks at one other point. It would be not functionally very practical. So I quite early on skipped, though I tested should it be could even a circular form be possible, but I tested for quite a long time a long linear building, but quite early on then went for a more compact building. Put it at the end of this site, which was a long site, so the mourners could actually sort of walk and prepare themselves by walking up to the building. But how should this clearing be done? Should it be at all clearing around the building, or should it be sort of a more meandering, a more difficult way to reach? This was another question. And these are certainly not presentation drawings. They are very sort of personal thoughts about what's happening here. This is the road. I felt that the road and the walkway should probably be very close, because you can feel pretty lonely in the wood if there is no cars passing by. Though there could be undertakers' cars, but at least they're cars. I think the wood is I think to Swedes probably not bad, but it's also comforting to be around other people. So this was just one thought about, if the building is up here, that how they walk along this kind of driveway. And this was finally the solution about making a driveway up to a clearing which is here with a kind of block-like building. And this was the final solution when it came to this cut-out atrium for the personnel, and the opening where we kept many of the trees that were asked to be kept, as many as possible. So we said that let's keep a tree here, and this was the canopy. And all through this work, certainly I thought about materials. Should it be concrete? Should it be this? Should it be that? But I was very much focused on making the most efficient building. So this is in a more way how it is. This is the 3 cold stores, the major furnace hall, and the canopy where the mourners enter. And this is sort of the center of the people where the personnel are working. And then there was this question, how should this entry point for the mourners, how should that be arranged? That's the only really public part of the building. Inside it's quite small, but of course, how do you embrace, or how do you invite or the people that should come here in the wood with all the trees? So should it be an open space where they could be on their own, the mourners? That was one of many solutions. So that was a kind of recess into a building block, into a perimeter, and also a kind of where cars could load the coffins into also on a kind of courtyard. And then something higher where the furnaces were, because that was the highest, the demand for the highest ceiling that was in the furnace hall. This is another of many recessed courtyard a little bit further into, with waiting rooms and such things here. But in all, the plan is pretty much settled, but the critical issue was really, how do you make this building generous enough, or sort of kind enough for those coming there in their sorrow, which is probably the case. So this was really, and then I felt a courtyard in our climate, if it would be in Spain or even in Switzerland, may be great. But with our climate, with so much cold and so on, it usually gets pretty damp and not very, very nice. So finally, I found the idea of making rather a kind of canopy which had a big opening. So it wouldn't be a canopy which would be dark, but rather a canopy where you could sort of circulate around a kind of opening. And finally, This was something where I had the same size as in here, under the canopy, the same size for the opening in the canopy as in the courtyard for the personnel. That sort of created a kind of, a kind of rhyme, if you like, in the plan. Then started working on what about the covering? What about the roof? There was only one part that needed a high ceiling on the inside, which was the furnace hall here. So this was an idea, should there be sort of quite a complicated roof with many skylights or sort of, and this is what you see, but early on I felt this is it's not an art gallery, it's not a public building, so I felt it's more like a facility, so I felt maybe it should have a very simple roof, just a sort of a big blanket over the whole thing. And that is what this more or less means. Here there was this kind of opening for the people, for the mourners, and then the courtyard. And that was finally what has been done, the highest part being here, and then just a big sloping roof, which in the competition entry had something like this with a kind of canopy, which developed from being wood. I was quite interested in sort of this combination of the many materials, not making the buildings too sort of austere in one single material. Though I have changed that, and now I felt that in this particular case, it was better to sort of make it into all one. So it's all, as you see, the canopy is now all in brick. It's the same cover, it's the same blanket, also on the canopy here. And the wood is taken away. It's a risky thing having, of course, a tree close to the building. So instead I have a very large, massive granite column there. But also this opening at the center, which was similar, as I said, to the courtyard, is now really a slit at the end of this. So there's a long, this canopy is almost a kind of tongue reaching out from here, stretching out some 15 meters over to here, carried by these brick piers. And then there's a slit bringing down light on the gable facade of this furnace hall, which has two major windows and two large skylights. And this is what the plan is, very similar, as you see, to the competition plan. One less of cold storage, but the rest is really the same. And here are the brick piers. Here's the granite column. Here's the skylight, or sort of the opening to the sky. And this is all the same. And there's one room next to here. If you enter as a mourner, you come into a hall here, and you come in. Here is a place. It's a barrel vaulted space where the coffin may be put, so you may see the deceased, or you may also be standing here looking into when the coffin is put into the furnace, which is what mourners are supposed to see if they come here. They're not supposed to be in here, but they can be here, or they could come and fetch the urn. So you will see a vaulted space shortly. And this about the cars is about the same as in the competition. And here it is all now built under construction in white concrete. Luckily, we had made this private house in white concrete. So with a lot of debate, I could have the client and the contractors to build it all. Skanska is building it in white concrete, which is quite difficult because these walls here are really much higher and it's quite a shallow roof on top of it. But all this is now white concrete. But this is a competition entry image. And then we'd built a prototype at the site 2 winters or 1.5 years ago. It was a very cold winter. This was really to test all the details, also how the gutters should be, or the pipe, the draining from the roof should be taken care of along the lower part of the roof. And the roof, as you see, is the same as the walls, though the bricks are there lying on the flat side up. But in fact, it's the same brick, so it's a pretty simple geometry, or it's the same material all over. I don't know if I was there. So this is an very early model photograph, I think, of that space, which in fact has an overlit skylight bringing down a slit of light at its very end. So it's not a completely dark space, but it has the barrel vaulted ceiling and the light coming down on the side. And then there's actually the same white glazed bricks as we had in the church. So here is more or less the brick that is now slightly not quite so dark. That's the brick for this villa. And these are pavings from Athens from a very interesting architect, Dimitri Piccionis, from the 1940s, that I think is very inspiring. And we had, rather than doing some small size paving, we tried to do very large paving that are scattered almost. If you saw my early sketch about the walkway up to this mourner's entrance, there was a kind of scattered stones among the trunks. And these are then granite, very large granite slabs of some 1.5 meter size. So this is now what is being done. Finally, well, this is the main facade where the mourner's entrance is. And then there's a lot of technicalities here. Here is a very long grill. You know, with all the heat that is produced from the furnaces, you need to get a lot of ventilation. So here is a 30-meter long brick grill. Instead of having a lot of steel, there's certainly steel where the air is going up through the sort of Corten steel here. But in fact, all this long wall is a kind of brick grill. Maybe it will be shown shortly. And here, the highest part of the building is the furnace hall. Here's a cut through the building and into this tiny courtyard for the personnel, which also is all white concrete. And then the bricks coming down on the sides. The same plan again. Here are the drainage on a corner. This is how the brick is sort of on the end. You cannot cut all the brick, or you can, but we preferred not to cut all the bricks, but rather have quite a bit of mortar at the joints. Well, the same courtyard for the personnel, as I said. So here are glazing right here. So it's a warm corridor on all sides of the atrium. That's the space. And the motto, as I said, was a stone in the forest. We have retrieved a few stones that were actually just in the position where the building is. So they will be put in this courtyard in the spring when it's finished. And here are some details this is then the white concrete in the structure, that on top of it has foam glass insulation, and then there's a layer of membrum for the water, and then on top of that is another concrete, and then there's a mortar which can withstand the frost, and then there's the brick on top. And this is the cladding of the brick, which has a completely wild, compared to the first scheme with the sort of textile seams, as I said, this has a very wild pattern of the bricks. But the insulation is not ordinary, but it rather is a perlite. It's this kind of volcanic ash that you use for gardens and such things. And here's one of the model photographs of the public entry with the major granite column and the major entry that I suggested for the furnace hall. It wasn't asked for, but I felt it was quite important to have also one kind of public entry to the furnace hall in case of a large funeral of some kind. Well, the detail again on the roof. Here is, as I said, there were Corten grills where all the heat is coming up, and maybe there's an image showing that's on this side. There's a lot of technicalities in this, and I haven't spoken a lot about that. Here are the sort of the grills where all the heating comes up, whereas here is this, what I call the brick grill. And the furnace hall, the opening to the furnace hall. And this is on the prototype that you saw in the winter. They were tested also. So here is how this, what I call brick grill, will look on the finished building. This is where all the heating comes, or the air comes in, and the coolers are standing on the inside of that, place. Another model photograph of the canopy and the opening, or the major opening. But of course the mourners will walk this way. This was how the clearing was just before construction started. And some of these they don't look so impressive, but some of these trunks of trees are really very impressive. And here you see, this is now maybe a month ago, the image, but the brickwork is going on. And then what is most difficult here is, of course, is this thing, the white concrete, to do that in this sort of size and this kind of scale and with a speed that should be dealt with Skanska is quite demanding. But I think they're doing okay. And then so finally, as I said, the motto was a stone in the forest, and this is one of the stones that we moved in to this little courtyard for the personnel. And I think that will have to be the final image. Thank you. This was a bit rapid, but not for you, but I was maybe speaking quite rapidly. But please, if there are questions, I would be happy to answer. As you see, yes.
Is it hard to find masons now?
Yes, it is. But you could also express it as that there is difficult to get a good enough competition on the price because there are not so many firms that have really good masons, and there are, if they have masons, they're usually doing putz work. They are rather doing brick, not load-bearing brickwork. That's very rare. But luckily we have gotten some contacts through this. But this is actually, this particular work is done by Skanska's own sort of masons.
I was thinking mainly of the Årsta.
Yes, that was. But there are a few companies, but not many. And I think it was they had most of the masons there hadn't been doing structural brickwork, never. But some of them were still very good. So, but it's quite exciting to be involved in that because, of course, this kind of, when it's cladding, that's fine. It may look great, but doing something which is the same material, both the structure and it's also, this is really exciting. And I think it's exciting in that it's the same people doing sort of the load-bearing part as is doing the most refined, sort of the skin of the building. And that's pretty uncommon these days because usually we have one doing the concrete and one doing some cladding on top of that and then doing something else. In the Church of Årsta, it's 12 masons who did the whole building more or less. Then there were some concrete workers on the top, but the brick workers were really important there. And I think that heightened their self-esteem to some extent. And that was very nice. Okay, no more questions. Okay, thank you.